Well, look, I think we've got to look at the report very carefully and make sure that things are put in place to make sure nothing like this happens again. Although I would make the point that Prime Minister Scott Morrison on the 15th of March clearly said that he would have bespoke arrangements in place and that Border Force would be in command. So the report has clearly indicated that Border Force was not in command on the 19th of March when passengers disembarked. So I think while there's clear issues for the New South Wales government, I think the Australian people will be scratching their head about why the Prime Minister got a headline on the 15th of March, and then on the 19th of March, what he said was in place was actually not in place at all.
Julian, what are your thoughts on this? As we've just said, I mean, Border Force were not to blame for the mishap, according to this report. The Premier's taken the weekend to consider her response. What do you think would be appropriate?
Well, look, I haven't had a chance to read the report, but obviously what would be appropriate is to put in place measures to ensure that we learn from this. Look, it's a global pandemic. No one's got the script or the rule book about how to run these things, so things will not always go perfectly. But, you know, the report speaks for itself in terms of the role of the Australian Border Force. So, you know, this continued effort by Labor and particularly by Amanda to play politics with the officers of the Australian Border Force to try and impugn their efforts just for a cheap political shot, I think.
I'm not doing that, Julian. I'm pointing to the Prime Minister. It's the Prime Minister that said arrangements were in place on the 15th of March, and the passengers disembarked on the 19th. It comes back to the Prime Minister's credibility here.
Well, the Prime Minister wasn't on the dock, Amanda. You know, what you had was an expert health panel there on the dock to make those decisions. And the comments you were making was around why the Australian Border Force personnel, that they should have been doing more when the report clearly says they did their job. So I don't think we need to play politics with their efforts.
Do you think, though, Julian, I mean, we knew what happened with the Diamond Princess. That was docked off the coast of Japan for a number of weeks, that Australia could have learnt from the mistakes of the Diamond Princess. We knew the Ruby Princess was arriving a few weeks later, that Australia should have learned from those mistakes and had a plan in place prior?
Well, I think we do need to learn from these situations as they arise in the pandemic, absolutely. So this inquiry and the report is very important to ensure those learnings are had. And thankfully, what we've now got is answers about this issue, which we don't have in Victoria around hotel quarantine. In Victoria, because we have a Premier who's doggedly refused to answer questions even about the meetings he was in or his own state of mind or his own state of knowledge, we've been left with no answers and no ability to learn from it. So these inquiries are important, and it's important that the things out of the report are implemented.
All right, I want to move on to aged care now. The federal government is sending health authorities to take over 2 facilities in Victoria. Amanda, is enough being done right now to protect aged care residents?
Not at all, not at all. The Royal Commission has been absolutely clear that the government should have done more sooner and that they need to put a national plan in place. And the government's response has been, we'll discuss it at the National Cabinet later this week. That does not indicate the urgency that needs to occur in aged care. And I heard Julian just before trying to blame Dan Andrews. Well, he can't do it with this issue because aged care is solely the responsibility of the federal government. We had the Newmarch disaster in New South Wales, and the government failed to learn from that, failed to put a national plan in place. And when I hear reports that only now is there going to be agreements on rolling out training on infection control in aged care, that is way too late in terms of the aged care facilities and the residents and the families that think that they are doing the right thing for their loved one, putting them into aged care, only to realise there's been a failure on the federal government and absolutely, they need to act with some urgency, not wait later down the week to take heed of the issues that the Royal Commission has pointed out. And one of those is to get a national plan quickly in place so that we don't see this issue continuing to plague so many families, so many older Australians.
Julian, there have been reports that residents in some of these facilities were essentially abandoned and that there's not been enough staff. Given what we have learnt from the Aged Care Royal Commission. Does it mean that these lessons have yet to be learned?
Well, look, I have to reject Amanda's categorisation completely. I mean, the PM has said this is his number one focus, quite rightly. There's significant federal support going into aged care. There was federal guidelines put in place, a plan, if you will, back in March. It's been updated twice. The federal government is assisting to make sure that there's a surge workforce for aged care homes, making sure there's PPE.
It's solely
gear,
responsible,
that
Julian.
Hang on. Even Daniel Andrews has come forward and said what a good job that the PM is doing, that they are working together to make sure that aged care residents are looked after, as they should be. So every federal assistance is absolutely there to make sure that we look after our aged care residents.
The Royal Commission even to
the extent that Services Australia is making sure that there is mechanisms in place for families to do Zoom calls and to appropriately continue to talk to their aged care residents.
All right, let's move on now. Today, the Wesfarmers CEO, he's announced that he wants reform to the country's antiquated tax system. Amanda, given the current state of the economy due to this pandemic, is it time to overhaul the tax mix to help create jobs?
Well, look, our fundamental focus must be on creating jobs. And, of course, the specifics, we need to have a look at any detail on the table. But certainly encouraging targeted business investment is something, and I think there's a case absolutely to be made for targeted business investment. And, of course, also importantly, a jobs agenda. That needs to be on the table. In saying that, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, and I'm not sure, I guess, the specific tax reform he's talking about. Obviously, there'll be some that will be, that will be argued over. But, of course, boosting business investment and creating jobs needs to be our number one priority as we recover from this pandemic.
It's not unusual for business to call for something like this. But, Julian, I mean, given the time that we are in with the pandemic, is this a reasonable request?
Well, I think from what you just heard, for that wishy-washy answer from Amanda, you can tell that Labor's DNA is to tax more and to try and redistribute the wealth. The DNA of the coalition parties is simple: lower taxes to grow the economy. Before COVID, we were the party of lower taxes. We had legislated for lower taxes. The Labor Party had gone to the election with $387 billion worth of extra taxes. Imagine if we were carrying that through COVID. So my answer is, of course, we want to absolutely make sure that we can reduce taxes. The taxes are as low as possible. Now, I can't preempt any October budget announcements.
Who's wishy-washy now, Julian?
We will be looking for every opportunity to lower taxes, that's for sure.
Right,
sounds pretty wishy-washy to me.
So, some lively debate this morning. I just want to ask you quickly both about a vaccine before we finish. Of course, we know that yesterday Greg Hunt, he said that he was certainly optimistic. Amanda, how do we ensure that Australia does not get left behind?
Look, unfortunately, the government hasn't moved as quickly as it should have in securing agreement in terms of this vaccine. It's really important that if a vaccine's found, that Australians have access to it and that we can produce enough doses to make sure that our country is protected. So the government, I welcome the government's agreements. They are a bit belated, but we should also be investing in vaccine development as well. We have 2 candidates that I'm aware of in Australia being developed at the moment, and we should be looking at investing in those more heavily. So I think this is our ticket out of this pandemic, a vaccine, and I certainly hope that we're able to find one. But we need the government to be working overtime to make sure Australians have access to this, and they've been a little late to the table on that.
Julian, do you think the government has been too slow in entering these negotiations?
Oh, look, I heard these talking points from Anthony Albanese this morning. I mean, they're total garbage. I mean, does anybody really think that the government isn't committed to helping to find a vaccine and make it available to Australians? Of course we are. Of course we are making every resource available. You've had Scott Morrison standing up in press conference after press conference and in these bilateral discussions with other nations, calling on these nations, if they find the vaccine first, to make sure that it's available to everybody in the world, but particularly Australians. We've got some great research happening in my own electorate at UQ, which is being supported. And the other thing that we're doing is we're auditing our supply chains and our manufacturing capabilities so that when a vaccine does become available, we can manufacture it quickly and make it available to all Australians.